I swear, I was just trying to write some damn mystery novels in peace. That's all I wanted. A cabin, a trail, some quiet, and maybe a few squirrels, not a full-blown surveillance HOA Karen war. But nope, Daphne Riggs had other ideas. She thought my private trail was her jurisdiction, and things got real weird real fast. I mean, who calls the cops on someone for walking down their own property? Wait till you hear what happened when they ran my ID. Spoiler, she messed with the wrong guy. This one's from QA Stories. And if you've ever dealt with a power-tripping neighbor, tell me in the comments. I gotta know I'm not alone. You know that feeling when you think you finally found your perfect little slice of heaven, only to discover there's a snake in the garden? Yeah, that was my introduction to Daphne Riggs. I'd spent months searching for the perfect writing retreat, somewhere quiet, isolated, where I could focus on my mystery novels without distractions. When I found this lakeside cabin accessible only through a private trail, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. The realtor assured me the trail was mine, showed me the deed, and I signed on the dotted line, thinking my biggest worry would be whether to write by the fireplace or the lakeview window. Boy, was I wrong about that. The cabin reminded me of hiking with my dad through the woods behind our old house when I was 10 years old. He'd taught me to listen for the quiet spaces between bird calls, to notice how sunlight filtered through different types of leaves. Writing stories came naturally in places like that, where my imagination could wander without interruption from other people's expectations or regulations. I remember the last trip we took together before he got sick, sitting on a fallen log by a creek that sounded just like the one behind my cabin. "Quiet is a kind of protection, son," he'd said, watching water flow over smooth stones. "It lets you think clearly when everything else is noise." He'd been talking about the city we'd left behind for the weekend, but now I understood he meant something deeper. Peace isn't just the absence of sound, it's the presence of safety, the knowledge that you can exist without someone else deciding whether you belong. The first few weeks were exactly what I'd hoped for. I'd wake up, make coffee, and walk down my trail to the lake while my brain worked through plot points. Neighbors were polite. I didn't think much of it. I was finally settling into a routine when the emails started. At first I thought Daphne was just being neighborly. She introduced herself as the HOA president and mentioned she liked to welcome new residents personally. Her initial message seemed harmless enough, asking about my profession and how I was enjoying the community. I responded politely, mentioned I was a writer, and figured that would be the end of our correspondence. What struck me about her first email was the unnecessarily elaborate signature block she'd attached. It included an official HOA logo, her full title as President of the Lakeside Community Homeowners Association, and what appeared to be some kind of motto about maintaining community standards through collaborative oversight. The formality was excessive for what should have been a simple welcome message, like she was establishing authority rather than building relationships. But then the questions got weird, really weird. She wanted to know about my daily movement patterns and whether I had authorization documentation for using what she called the community trail access. I'm sitting there reading this email thinking, what the hell is she talking about? Community trail access? I own this trail. It's literally on my property deed. But Daphne seemed convinced otherwise. She started referencing HOA bylaws and community standards, claiming she needed to verify compliance with established protocols. I remember staring at my computer screen, wondering if this woman had confused my private property with some kind of shared community space. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I pulled out my property documents and sent her copies. Clear as day, the deed showed the trail as part of my land purchase. I even highlighted the relevant sections and attached a friendly note explaining that there seemed to be some confusion about ownership. At least this filing system is simpler than those government reports I used to handle, I thought to myself as I organized everything. I figured that would clear things up and we could all move on with our lives. Again, I was wrong. Daphne's response came back within hours, and her tone had shifted completely. Instead of acknowledging the documentation, she doubled down. She claimed my papers were incomplete and didn't show proper HOA approval for trail usage. She referenced section after section of community guidelines, most of which seemed to have nothing to do with private property rights. I'm reading this thing thinking, is this woman for real? She's telling me I can't use my own trail without HOA permission? But what really got me was her closing line. I trust you'll comply with community standards while we sort out these documentation discrepancies. The audacity was breathtaking. Here's someone who'd been living in the neighborhood for years, acting like she owned the place, telling me I need permission to walk on my own land. That's when I started paying attention to Daphne's behavior patterns. Every time I left my cabin or returned, I'd catch glimpses of her watching from her window. She'd be standing there with a notepad, actually taking notes about my comings and goings. At first, I thought maybe I was being paranoid. I mean, who does that? But then neighbors started mentioning it too. Mrs. Henderson from 3 houses down casually mentioned that Daphne had been asking questions about me, wanting to know if anyone had seen unusual activity around my property. What kind of unusual activity? Just me, living my life, walking to my own mailbox. The surveillance escalated when she started positioning herself in her front yard whenever I needed to use the trail. She'd pretend to be gardening or checking her mail, but her eyes never left me. I'd wave politely, she'd give this tight-lipped smile and wave back, and I could practically feel her mentally documenting every step I took. Looking back, I should have recognized the pattern sooner. This wasn't about trail access or community standards, this was about control. Daphne had decided I was some kind of threat to her authority, and she was building a case against me, one observation at a time. Then came the official warning letter. Hand-delivered, mind you, not mailed. She actually walked up to my door and handed me an envelope marked, "Urgent HO Violation Notice." The moment was awkward beyond belief. She stood there holding the envelope between us like some kind of ceremonial sword, her eyes locked on mine with this strange mixture of satisfaction and challenge. The silence stretched uncomfortably long before she finally spoke, her voice carrying that syrupy sweetness people use when they're enjoying wielding power over others. Inside was a formal letter demanding I cease unauthorized use of community trail access pending resolution of ownership disputes. She'd even included a map, a hand-drawn map, showing what she claimed were HOA property boundaries that somehow included my trail. The woman had literally redrawn property lines to support her delusion. I'm standing in my doorway, holding this letter, watching her walk back to her house with this satisfied little strut and thinking, what exactly have I gotten myself into here? This was starting to feel less like a property dispute and more like psychological warfare. Part of me wanted to dismiss the whole thing as the ramblings of an overzealous neighbor who'd gotten drunk on a tiny bit of authority. Maybe I was overthinking this entire situation, reading malice into what could just be misguided community enthusiasm. But another part of me, the part that had learned to trust patterns and document everything, was telling me this was just the beginning. Staring at Daphne's final warning email, I had to make a choice. I could stay quiet and let her think she'd won, or I could show her exactly what happens when you corner someone who's got nothing left to lose. But did I really want to open that door again? You know what they say about people who get a little bit of power? They always want more. Well, Daphne wasn't content with just sending threatening letters and playing neighborhood watch. No, she decided to take things physical. I woke up one morning, grabbed my coffee, and headed down my trail for my usual walk to the lake. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth that I'd grown to love about this place. Birds were just starting their dawn chorus, and everything felt peaceful and natural until I rounded the first bend. Except I couldn't get there. Someone had installed brand new no trespassing HOA property signs right across the trail entrance, complete with orange plastic barriers that looked like they came from a road construction site. The signs were professionally printed, I'll give her that, but they were mounted on cheap stakes that wobbled in the morning breeze. The jarring sight of artificial orange plastic against the natural backdrop of trees and undergrowth was like finding graffiti on a cathedral wall. Standing there with my coffee getting cold, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just harassment anymore, this was destruction of property access. She'd physically blocked my ability to reach the lake from my own cabin. I walked around the barriers, took photos from every angle, and started documenting everything with the same methodical approach I'd learned from my old job. Timestamps, weather conditions, exact positioning of each sign and barrier. The familiar routine felt both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because I knew what I was doing. Disturbing because I'd hoped never to need these skills again in civilian life. If Daphne wanted to play games, I was going to make sure I had evidence of every single move she made. But honestly, part of me was also getting excited. This felt familiar, like working a case where the suspect keeps making bigger and bigger mistakes. I spent that morning doing research, pulling up the original 1974 federal documents that came with my property purchase. Most of it was standard stuff, but there was an interesting notation I'd glossed over before. The trail was designated as a federal emergency access route back when the development was first planned. The language was pretty specific, too. Trail access cannot be restricted, blocked, or transferred under any circumstances. I'm not sure why they designated such a remote trail for federal emergency access, but the documentation was clear. Not only did I own the trail, but federal law specifically prohibited anyone from blocking it. Daphne had just committed a federal offense without even realizing it. The irony was almost beautiful. Armed with this information, I decided to handle things the direct way. I walked back down to the barriers, picked up every single sign and plastic barrier, and threw them into the bushes beside the trail. The first stake snapped clean in half when I yanked it from the ground, the crack echoing through the morning quiet like a gunshot. One of the plastic barriers caught on a branch and tipped over with a loud crash that sent a squirrel scrambling up the nearest tree. Let me tell you, that felt good. Really good. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like I was taking control instead of just reacting to Daphne's latest scheme. I took more photos showing the cleared trail, documented the time and date, and went about my day feeling pretty satisfied with myself. That satisfaction lasted exactly 4 hours. I was inside writing when I heard shouting outside my front door. Not talking, not arguing, full-on shouting. I opened the door to find Daphne standing in my driveway, red-faced and practically vibrating with rage. "You destroyed official HOA property. This is vandalism. I'm calling the police and having you arrested," she screamed at me. "You're nothing but a rogue element disrupting our community order. You think you can just ignore HOA authority and do whatever you want? This is exactly the kind of dangerous behavior our residents need protection from. Official HOA property?" I actually had to stop and stare at her after that one. These were cheap signs stuck in the ground on my land, but she was talking about them like they were permanent municipal fixtures. The disconnect from reality was honestly impressive. But here's where it got really interesting. While she's ranting about vandalism and police arrests, she let slip something that caught my attention. "I've improved this community's property values by over 30% through my management," she said. "Every decision I make benefits everyone here. Around here, I decide who goes where and when. There are no exceptions to my authority." Did you catch that? No exceptions to her authority. She wasn't talking about HOA rules or community standards anymore. She was talking about personal authority over other people's property. That's when I realized this wasn't really about the trail at all. This was about someone who'd figured out how to turn a neighborhood position into personal power, and I'd just become her first real challenge to that power. I stayed calm during her tirade, which seemed to make her even angrier. I explained again that the trail was private property, showed her the federal documentation about emergency access rights, and suggested she consult with an attorney before making any more accusations about vandalism. Looking back, I think my calm response was what really set her off. She expected me to get defensive, to argue back, maybe even to back down. Instead, I was treating her like what she was, someone making threats they couldn't legally follow through on. "This isn't over," she said before storming off. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The irony of that statement would become clear soon enough. That night, I sat in my cabin, reviewing everything that had happened and trying to figure out what Daphne's real game was. The trail thing was clearly just the surface issue, but what was underneath? Why was she so determined to control access to this particular piece of property? And why did she seem so confident that she could override federal documentation with HOA authority? I pulled out a legal pad and started making notes, connecting dots the way I used to when I was working cases. Property disputes don't usually escalate this quickly, unless there's something else going on, something bigger. People don't risk federal charges over neighborhood petty disputes unless they're protecting something valuable. I also couldn't shake the feeling that I'd heard variations of her 30% property value improvement claim before. People don't usually cite specific numbers like that unless they're covering for something or trying to justify questionable decisions. In my experience, when someone keeps mentioning how much they've helped a community financially, it's worth taking a closer look at where exactly that money went. But I was getting ahead of myself. First, I needed to see what Daphne's next move would be. Something told me she wasn't done escalating this situation. Watching Daphne storm off, threatening police and lawsuits, something cold settled in my chest. She wanted to play hardball? Fine. But opening that door meant becoming someone I'd tried to leave behind. Was I ready for that? The next few weeks taught me something about small community dynamics that I really wish I'd never had to learn. See, Daphne wasn't content with just harassing me directly. She'd decided to turn the entire neighborhood against me, and honestly, she was pretty good at it. Neighbors who used to wave when they saw me started crossing the street to avoid eye contact. People I'd chatted with at the mailbox suddenly had urgent business elsewhere whenever I appeared. At first I thought maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was getting paranoid because of all the stress with Daphne. But then the anonymous notes started showing up, and I realized this was a coordinated campaign designed to make me feel like an outsider in my own neighborhood. I remembered just a few weeks earlier helping Tom from across the street load a bag of mulch into his truck when his back was acting up. We'd laughed about getting older and how yard work seemed to get harder every year. He'd mentioned wanting to grab a beer sometime and talk about my writing. Now, that same neighbor wouldn't even make eye contact when he checked his mail, hurrying back inside like I carried some kind of contagious disease. The transformation was so complete and sudden that it felt surreal, like I'd somehow slipped into an alternate reality where everyone knew something I didn't. The first one appeared in my mailbox on a Tuesday morning. Stop causing trouble or face consequences. No signature, typed on plain white paper. The second one came 3 days later. Nobody wants you here anymore, then leave while you still can. I'm standing at my mailbox reading these things, thinking, seriously, are we in middle school? But the notes kept coming, and they were getting more specific. Someone was clearly watching my daily routine because they referenced things like what time I got my mail and when I took my evening walks. One particularly unsettling note was tucked into my screen door, which meant someone had walked right up to my house in the dark. The thought of anonymous figures creeping around my property while I slept made my skin crawl. That's when Mrs. Thompson approached me while I was checking my mail one evening. The elderly woman looked nervous, glancing around like she was afraid of being seen talking to me. "Don't make the same mistake I made," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I tried to question her methods once, years ago. Asked about some expenses that didn't add up. Next thing I knew, I was getting fines for everything. Mailbox too close to the street, wrong shade of paint on my shutters, grass 2 inches too long. She made my life hell until I apologized publicly at a meeting. Her eyes were sad and tired, like she'd been carrying this burden for too long. I should have fought back then. Maybe if I had, you wouldn't be going through this now. The whole situation was starting to feel like something out of one of my own mystery novels, except it wasn't fiction and it wasn't fun. I wasn't sure if I should be insulted or impressed by the level of coordination Daphne had managed to achieve. Even the sound of birds scattering from trees near my property started making me flinch, every unexpected noise feeling like potential surveillance or threat. Then I noticed the signs. Not HOA signs this time, personal ones. Signs started appearing, all facing my home. Message was clear. A neighbor from 2 streets over, who used to chat about her roses whenever we ran into each other, now had one of these signs prominently displayed and wouldn't make eye contact when I drove past. The coordination was impressive, actually. Daphne had managed to convince people that I was some kind of danger to community safety. I had to admire the efficiency of her propaganda campaign, even as it was destroying my peace of mind. But the real isolation hit when local businesses started giving me the cold shoulder. The hardware store where I'd been getting supplies suddenly couldn't help with deliveries. Too busy, they said, even though I could see their delivery truck sitting empty in the parking lot. The grocery store workers became weirdly formal and unhelpful. Even the mailman started acting strange, like he was nervous about approaching my property. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but it felt like the entire community had gotten together and decided I was persona non grata. Looking back, I should have known this was just the beginning. Daphne was systematically isolating me before moving to whatever her next phase was going to be. That's when my old investigative instincts really kicked in. If Daphne could coordinate this level of community pressure, she had to be pretty influential. And if she was this influential, I wanted to know why. So I started digging into HOA records, property documents, and anything else I could get my hands on legally. What I found was interesting, very interesting. See, I'd assumed that all these HOA rules Daphne kept referencing were legitimate. I'd been operating under the assumption that maybe I'd misunderstood something about community bylaws or missed some fine print in my property purchase. Turns out, I should have trusted my instincts from the beginning. But when I compared different versions of the HOA bylaws, the original, from when the development was established versus the current version on file, I found some discrepancies. big discrepancies. The original bylaws, the ones that were legally filed with the county, contained no mention of trail access restrictions. None. But the current version that Daphne had been quoting included a very specific Rule 17b that prohibited private trail access without HOA approval. The thing is, there was no record of when this rule was added, no community vote, no legal amendment process. It was like someone had just inserted it into the document and hoped nobody would notice. I dug deeper, using some of the computer skills I'd picked up from my previous work. Years of analyzing government documents had taught me to spot inconsistencies and trace digital fingerprints, skills I'd hoped never to need again in civilian life. The metadata on the digital version of the bylaws told a fascinating story. Rule 17b had been added to the document just 6 weeks ago, from Daphne's personal computer. At 2:15 in the morning, she'd literally fabricated an HOA regulation to justify her harassment campaign against me. I'm sitting there staring at the evidence on my computer screen, and I can't decide if I'm more impressed by her audacity or appalled by her stupidity. Who creates fake legal documents and thinks nobody will ever check? Apparently, someone who's been getting away with manipulating community rules for so long that she's forgotten other people might actually read them. But here's the thing that really got my attention. If she was willing to fabricate rules about trail access, what else might she be fabricating? I had learned a long time ago that people who commit small frauds usually commit bigger ones too. It's like lying. Once you start, it becomes easier to justify the next one. So I started looking at other recent changes to HOA documents, other decisions Daphne had made without community input, other areas where she might be overstepping her actual authority. And that's when things got really interesting. The pattern of unauthorized changes went back much further than just my situation. The thrill of investigation was coming back, that feeling of pieces clicking together to form a bigger picture. This wasn't just about some control freak neighbor anymore. This was about someone who'd figured out how to manipulate an entire community system for personal gain. The question was, what exactly was she gaining? Money? Power? Both? I was pretty sure I knew how to find out, but it would mean fully committing to treating this like a real case instead of just a neighborly dispute. Was I ready to go down that rabbit hole? Did I want to become the person who destroys someone's life even if they deserved it? Staring at the evidence of Daphne's fabricated rules, I felt that familiar rush from my old job. The question was, did I want to be the person who quietly exposed her, or the one who made her pay for every threat, every sleepless night, every neighbor she turned against me? Sometimes the most frustrating thing about being right is when nobody wants to hear it. I'd spent weeks documenting Daphne's fabricated rules, gathering evidence, and preparing what I thought was an airtight case. Having investigated fraud cases before, I knew how to present evidence clearly and logically. So when the monthly HOA meeting came around, I requested time on the agenda to present what I diplomatically called concerns about recent rule changes. Daphne agreed, probably because she was confident in her community's support. Looking back, I should have realized that confidence wasn't just arrogance. She genuinely believed these people would choose loyalty over facts. Maybe I'd misread them. Maybe I'd gone too far, too fast. The community center was packed that night, maybe 40 residents total. More people than I'd seen at any gathering since moving here. Word had apparently gotten around that there was going to be some kind of confrontation between the new guy and their beloved HOA president. I set up my laptop, organized my documents, and prepared to present the evidence the same way I used to present findings to federal supervisors. Professional, factual, unambiguous. I honestly thought I was about to watch Daphne's whole scheme collapse under the weight of documented proof. Shows you how much I understood about suburban politics versus actual law enforcement. I started with the side-by-side comparison of the original bylaws versus the current version, projected them right up on the screen so everyone could see the differences. I showed evidence the rule was fabricated. Date, time, her computer, no vote. Someone coughed loudly during my explanation, cutting through the silence like they were trying to interrupt. I provided copies of my property documentation proving legal trail ownership, and I even brought the original federal emergency access designation from 1974. Everything was clear, factual, and legally sound. I thought I was teaching a masterclass in evidence presentation, but the response wasn't what I expected. At all. Instead of outrage or demands for accountability, I got confusion and discomfort. People shifted in their seats, looked at each other uncertainly, and when I asked for questions, the responses were disappointing. Several neighbors avoided my gaze entirely, studying their hands or the floor like they'd never seen them before. "I don't understand all this computer stuff, but I trust our president," said one elderly gentleman. "Why would Daphne lie? She's done so much for our community," asked a woman from the back row. "This seems like a personal dispute that should be handled privately," suggested another neighbor. "Maybe you should just use a different route to avoid problems." I'm standing there with irrefutable evidence of document fraud, and people are suggesting I should just find a different way to walk to my own lake? The disconnect was surreal. These weren't stupid people, but they'd apparently decided that maintaining their comfortable relationship with Daphne was more important than addressing the fact that she'd been making up rules to harass their neighbor. I felt like I was trying to explain calculus at a magic show, technically correct, but completely missing the audience. Something inside me started to crack. My voice got louder, more desperate. "Don't you understand what this means?" I heard myself saying, my composure finally slipping. "She's been lying to all of you for years, making up rules, controlling your lives with fake authority." The room went dead silent, and I realized I was almost shouting at people who just wanted their quiet neighborhood drama to go away. Their faces were mostly blank, unreadable masks that left me questioning whether I was seeing sympathy, fear, or simple indifference. Daphne's response was masterful, I'll give her that. She didn't address the evidence directly. Instead, she focused on emotions and relationships. She talked about her years of dedicated service to the community, how she'd worked tirelessly to improve property values and maintain neighborhood standards. She dismissed my documentation as technical confusion and suggested that my aggressive approach was exactly the kind of behavior the community needed protection from. "When a community thrives, it's because leaders make hard decisions," she said, looking directly at me. "I've dedicated years to improving this community. I would never violate the trust you've placed in me." The performance was perfect. Wounded authority figure being attacked by ungrateful newcomer. Then she did something I hadn't expected. She turned my own evidence against me by questioning why someone would go to such lengths to discredit their HOA president. "What kind of person moves into a quiet neighborhood and immediately starts demanding access to restricted areas?" she asked. "What kind of person responds to reasonable questions by launching an investigation into community leadership?" The implication was clear. Normal people don't have the skills or motivation to analyze document metadata and federal property designations. Normal people don't treat neighborly disputes like criminal investigations. She was painting me as the abnormal one, and it was working. The meeting ended without any decisions, without even scheduling follow-up discussion. People filed out with expressions I couldn't read, maybe sympathetic, maybe fearful, maybe just eager to escape. I was left sitting alone in the community center with my laptop and my box of evidence, feeling like I'd just failed some kind of test I didn't know I was taking. The worst part was realizing that facts don't matter when people have already chosen their reality. They'd decided Daphne was their protector, and I was the threat she was protecting them from. No amount of evidence was going to penetrate that emotional barrier. Driving home that night, I thought about all the stories I'd shared on QA Stories about bureaucratic injustice and small-town corruption. I'd always wondered what it would feel like to be on the receiving end of that kind of coordinated dismissal. Now I knew, and it was worse than I'd imagined. The isolation wasn't just social anymore, it was intellectual. These people had seen clear evidence of wrongdoing, and chosen to ignore it because acknowledging it would mean admitting they'd been manipulated. What would you do in my position? Give up and find somewhere else to live, or dig deeper into what Daphne was really hiding? Walking to my car with a box of dismissed evidence, I realized something important. Maybe I was asking the wrong questions. Maybe this was never about trail access at all. Maybe Daphne's real secret was much bigger. You know what they say about following the money? It usually leads somewhere interesting, and sometimes, if you're really unlucky, it leads to discovering that your neighbor has been running a sophisticated embezzlement scheme right under everyone's noses. After the disaster at the community meeting, I realized I'd been approaching this whole situation wrong. I'd been treating it like a property dispute, when I should have been treating it like a fraud investigation. Because here's the thing. People don't fabricate legal documents just for the fun of controlling their neighbors. They do it because there's something valuable at stake. And if Daphne was willing to commit document fraud to control access to my trail, I needed to figure out what she was really after. So I started looking at HOA finances, which as a resident I had every legal right to review. Daphne initially refused to provide the records, claiming they were under review by our accountant. But I knew enough about HOA law to formally request them in writing, and she couldn't legally refuse without risking bigger problems. When she finally handed over the financial documents, her whole demeanor had changed. She was nervous, defensive, and kept emphasizing that everything has been properly documented and approved by the board. That emphasis on documentation was interesting, considering what I'd already discovered about her relationship with accurate record-keeping. The financial records told a fascinating story once I knew what to look for. Over the past 18 months, the HOA had paid out $23,000 to something called Riggs Landscaping. $23,000. That's what peace of mind costs around here, apparently. For a small neighborhood HOA, that's a huge chunk of the annual budget. But here's what made it really interesting. Most of those payments were for work on community trail maintenance and erosion control projects. The same trail that Daphne had been claiming was abandoned and needed to be closed off for safety reasons. She'd been billing the community thousands of dollars to fix a trail that she simultaneously claimed was too dangerous for anyone to use. I started cross-referencing the invoices with actual work performed, and that's when the pattern became clear. Daphne had created a perfect little scam, and it was almost elegant in its simplicity. Step 1. Fabricate Rule 17b to justify claiming the trail was community property. Step 2. Declare the abandoned trail a safety hazard requiring expensive maintenance. Step 3. Award the maintenance contracts to Riggs Landscaping, which a quick business license search revealed was owned by none other than Daphne Riggs herself. Step 4. Submit invoices for work that was either never performed or completely unnecessary. Unbelievable. She billed them for erosion control and never laid a single rock. Step 5. Collect HOA funds for improving property that she'd simultaneously declared off-limits to residents. The documentation was laughably fake once I knew what to look for. Before and after photos that were clearly stock images downloaded from landscaping websites, the so-called before photo was from a garden blog, and I found it in 6 seconds on Google. Work orders for materials that were never delivered, according to local supplier records. Invoices for native plant restoration on a trail that still looked exactly the same as when I'd moved in. She'd been billing the HOA thousands of dollars for imaginary work on property that residents weren't even allowed to access to verify the improvements. Who steals money and then makes it impossible for anyone to check if the work was actually done? That's when I found the envelope in my mailbox. It was damp from the morning dew, stuffed just far enough in to suggest secrecy, not carelessness. No return address, but inside were copies of additional financial records I hadn't seen yet, along with a handwritten note. She's been stealing from us for years. I've been too scared to speak up, but watching what she's doing to you made me realize someone has to act. There's more if you need it. The additional records showed the scope was even bigger than I'd realized. Daphne hadn't limited herself to trail maintenance. She'd been billing for community entrance improvements, drainage consultations, and landscape assessments that seemed to exist only on paper. The anonymous informant had also included copies of emails between Daphne and board members, where she'd systematically convinced them that these expenses were necessary for maintaining property values and preventing liability issues. She'd created an entire narrative about community improvement while systematically emptying the HOA treasury into her own business account. The trail dispute wasn't about control or community standards. It was about protecting a profitable fraud scheme that she'd been running for years. Every time she mentioned those property value improvements, she was literally talking about money she'd stolen from the people she was supposed to be serving. Sitting in my cabin that night, surrounded by evidence of systematic embezzlement, I felt that familiar cold satisfaction from my old investigative days. This was exactly the kind of financial fraud I used to specialize in tracking down, except instead of investigating it for federal agencies, I was living through it as the victim. The trail was never the real issue. Daphne needed to control it, so she could justify stealing money to fix it. Classic embezzlement with manufactured justification. She'd turned me into the villain to hide the fact that she'd been robbing her own neighbors for years. But now I had a choice to make. I had enough evidence to expose her quietly, maybe through the proper channels, and let justice take its slow, bureaucratic course. Or I could make sure she faced immediate public consequences for every threat, every sleepless night, and every neighbor she'd turned against me. Looking back, I still can't believe I was even considering the quiet route. After everything she'd put me through, after watching her systematically manipulate an entire community, the idea of gentle justice felt like letting her off easy. Could I live with letting her walk away? Or was it time to go loud? Looking at $23,000 in fraudulent invoices, I wondered, was this evidence enough to bring her down quietly, or would I need to go nuclear? Some lines, once you cross them, change you forever. Was I ready to become that person again? There's something almost beautiful about watching someone's carefully constructed world collapse in real time, especially when they're the architect of their own destruction. And let me tell you, Daphne's final performance was a masterpiece of self-destruction. She'd been getting increasingly desperate over the past few weeks. Word was starting to spread about financial irregularities. Some residents were asking uncomfortable questions about those landscaping contracts, and she could sense her control slipping. You could see it in the way she moved around the neighborhood. More frantic, more aggressive, like a cornered animal looking for an escape route. So she decided to make one final, dramatic play to regain her authority. Unfortunately for her, she chose the absolute worst possible target for that play. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when everything went sideways. I was walking down my trail to the lake, same routine I'd been following for months, when I heard shouting from the direction of Daphne's house. At first I thought maybe she was having some kind of emergency, but then I realized she was on the phone, and the shouting was directed at whoever she was talking to. I couldn't make out all the words, but I caught enough to realize she was calling 911 about me. I actually stopped walking and just stood there listening, because honestly, what could she possibly be reporting? The audacity of calling emergency services on someone for walking on their own property was so absurd that I almost wanted to applaud the performance. She called 911, claimed I was armed and unstable. I wasn't surprised. The performance was actually impressive. She managed to sound genuinely terrified and urgent. If I didn't know better, I might have been concerned about this mysterious, dangerous person she was describing. Too bad for her that the dangerous person was just me, walking to my own lake with a cup of coffee. 2 patrol cars arrived within about 15 minutes. Lieutenant Damies, who looked like he'd been doing this job for 20 years, and a younger officer who seemed thorough and professional. Daphne met them in the street, gesturing dramatically toward my property while maintaining that same terrified, urgent demeanor she'd used on the phone. I decided to stay put and let them come to me rather than approaching and potentially escalating whatever story she'd told them. Sometimes the best strategy is just to remain calm and let the other person's lies unravel naturally. When the officers approached me, I was sitting on my front steps, finishing my coffee. They were professional but cautious, which I completely understood given whatever Daphne had told them. I handed over my identification without any protest or attitude, just calm cooperation. Lieutenant Davies examined my license, and that's when things got interesting. The lieutenant stopped speaking mid-sentence, tapped twice on his radio, then looked at me differently, not like a suspect, like a bomb they'd just realized they were standing next to. Their eyes flicked to mine. Something changed. I knew that look. I'd seen it before in courtrooms and safe houses. A few minutes later, the younger officer showed Davies something on his screen, and both officers' entire demeanor shifted. They went from cautious law enforcement to something much more formal and careful. Davies came back to me with a completely different energy and asked if we could speak privately. We walked a few steps away from where Daphne was still pacing around her driveway, clearly expecting to see me arrested and hauled away in handcuffs. What happened next was probably the most satisfying moment of this entire ordeal. Was I ready for what came next? For the target this might paint? For how she'd react when her delusion broke in public? Lieutenant Davies returned to Daphne with what I can only describe as professional concern mixed with barely contained irritation. "Ma'am," he said, "Mr. Wells is under federal protection as part of a witness security program. Preventing him from accessing his designated safe property, filing false reports about him, or continuing to harass him could be considered interfering with a protected federal witness. That's a serious federal offense." They didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. Every word landed like a verdict. What happened next was pure social media gold. I noticed several neighbors had gathered with their phones out, recording everything from their front yards and windows. The confrontation was being live-streamed to the neighborhood Facebook group in real time. Comments were already pouring in, people sharing the video, tagging friends, expressing shock and disbelief. "OMG, is this really happening? I can't believe she called the cops on him. Wait, he's in federal protection? What did she do?" The digital pile-on was swift and merciless. Daphne's public humiliation was being documented from multiple angles, shared and reshared across social platforms. Her reputation wasn't just being destroyed locally, it was being broadcast for posterity. The silence that followed was absolutely perfect. Daphne went from triumphant, vindictive, to pale and speechless in about 3 seconds. Her response was everything I could have hoped for. She looked at the ground as if it would open and swallow her. Davies wasn't having any of it. "Ma'am, I strongly suggest you avoid any further contact with Mr. Wells and consult with an attorney," the younger officer added. Any additional harassment could result in federal charges. The woman who'd spent months telling everyone that she decided who goes where and when had just discovered that some people are protected by authorities way above her pay grade. The officers spoke with me privately for a few more minutes, confirming my safety and offering additional protection if needed. They were professional and courteous, but I could tell they weren't thrilled about having their time wasted with false reports targeting a federal witness. When they left, Daphne was standing in her driveway looking like she'd just been hit by a truck. The woman who'd orchestrated months of harassment and community isolation had just learned that her target was under federal protection, and every single thing she'd done could now be classified as interference with a protected witness. The whole neighborhood had watched it happen, recorded it, and shared it with the world. Watching Daphne's world crumble in real time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or vindication, but something colder. Was this justice finally served? Or was I becoming someone I didn't want to recognize? Word spread fast, people talked, eyes turned to her finally. The woman who'd been terrorizing residents had unknowingly interfered with federal business. The community shifted overnight from seeing me as the troublemaker to realizing they'd been manipulated by someone stealing from them for years. They didn't speak to her, but they didn't need to. Their silence had weight now. The emergency HOA meeting was called for Saturday. The same residents who dismissed my evidence were now demanding Daphne's removal. Some stood, others whispered, but the moment her resignation passed, the room exhaled like it had been holding its breath for years. Suddenly everyone remembered feeling uncomfortable with her decisions and claimed they'd always suspected something wasn't right. Daphne was removed by unanimous vote. Her closest allies abandoned her faster than rats leaving a sinking ship. The same people who dismissed my concerns were now competing to express the most outrage about her financial improprieties. Criminal charges were filed for embezzlement, fraud, and filing false police reports. The judge didn't flinch. He read the list: embezzlement, wire fraud, obstruction, like he was peeling away her mask, piece by piece. Her assets were frozen, business lost contracts, house went up for sale. Personal bankruptcy seemed inevitable. The new HOA president implemented transparency measures that should have been in place from the beginning. All financial records became publicly accessible online, contracts required multiple competitive bids, and rule changes needed community approval. People seemed genuinely surprised that HOA business could be conducted without drama or manufactured emergencies. What surprised me most was how quickly the community healing began once the truth came out. Mrs. Henderson pressed a tin of cookies into my hands and wouldn't meet my eyes. "We let her win too long," she whispered. "Thanks for stopping her." Other neighbors followed with similar acknowledgments, explaining they'd received threats about fines for associating with troublemakers and had been afraid to speak up against her coordinated pressure campaigns. It turned out that Daphne's control had been maintained through fear and intimidation, not actual community support. The anonymous tipster revealed herself as Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who'd been documenting Daphne's financial irregularities for months, but had been too intimidated to come forward alone. "I watched her steal from us for years," she told me, "but I was too scared to speak up by myself. You gave me the courage to do what was right." Several other residents admitted they'd had similar concerns, but had been isolated and intimidated into silence through Daphne's systematic campaign of community manipulation. The full scope of her psychological control over the neighborhood was becoming clear, and it was more extensive than I'd realized. The final audit revealed the complete scope of her theft: $47,000 in fraudulent contracts over 2 years. This included the $23,000 I'd initially discovered, plus additional schemes involving fake drainage projects, non-existent landscape consultations, and phantom community improvements that existed only on paper. $47,000 stolen from her own neighbors through fake invoices, stock photos, and manufactured emergencies. The audacity was breathtaking, but so was the stupidity. She'd gotten so comfortable with the community's lack of oversight that she'd stopped even trying to make her fraud believable. 3 months later, I found myself sitting on my lakeside cabin porch with morning coffee, reflecting on how dramatically everything had changed. The trail had become a popular walking spot for families in the neighborhood, something Daphne had actively discouraged during her reign of manufactured terror. Children played safely in the area. Neighbors actually talked to each other instead of living in fear of HOA violations, and the community was functioning the way it should have been all along. A copy of HOA Laws for Dummies sat on my table, a gag gift from my new neighbor friends who'd learned to appreciate both transparency and humor. I wasn't sure if I should laugh or cry at how much better everything was without one person's toxic influence poisoning the entire community dynamic. My phone buzzed with a text from my federal contact. Heard you had some local trouble that got resolved. Everything back to normal? I responded. Turned out the investigative skills transferred perfectly. Suburban fraud follows the same patterns as federal cases, just smaller numbers and bigger egos. The experience had reminded me why I'd enjoyed that work. The satisfaction of following evidence to logical conclusions and seeing justice served to people who thought they were untouchable. There's something deeply satisfying about watching someone who's spent years manipulating others finally face real consequences for their actions. 6 months later, my latest mystery novel, The Homeowners Association, became a regional bestseller. The dedication read, "To small-town tyrants everywhere, choose your targets more carefully." Daphne's house sold to a young family whose kids love playing on the trail, and the HOA operates transparently with engaged, informed residents who understand that community leadership means service, not domination. The real lesson wasn't about HOAs or property rights or even federal protection. It was about what happens when petty power meets real consequences. Sometimes karma needs a little help from someone who knows how to document evidence and follow money trails. Before I finished my morning coffee, I walked down to the trailhead where it all started. There, hanging from a sturdy oak branch, was my father's old canteen, the one he'd carried on our hiking trips when I was a kid. I'd found it in a box of his things and decided it belonged here, where the quiet he'd taught me to value had been worth fighting for. The metal was weathered but solid, a reminder that some things endure when you're willing to protect them. Quiet is a kind of protection, I said to the empty trail, remembering his words. But sometimes silence takes a fight. And that's how one woman's obsession with control led to her losing everything she thought she'd built. Daphne made the classic mistake of assuming she knew who she was dealing with, and it cost her everything. The real lesson here isn't about HOAs or property rights or even federal protection. It's about what happens when petty power meets real consequences. Daphne spent years bullying residents into compliance, but she picked the wrong person for her final target. If you enjoyed watching justice served with a side of irony, you know what to do. And if you've got your own HOA horror story, I'd love to hear how you handled it. Until next time, remember, in a world full of Daphnes, be the person who stands up for what's right, documents everything, and never underestimate the power of following the money trail. I'd bought this place to escape noise. Turns out peace takes a fight too. But the trail's open again, the lake's quiet, and justice finally feels like silence. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. Honestly, I didn't expect a hiking trail to turn into a federal case, but here we are. If this mess taught me anything, it's that silence isn't free. You earn it. And sometimes you earn it by standing your ground against someone who's way too used to getting their way. If you got something out of this story, feel free to like the video, drop a comment, or subscribe to QA Stories. We've got more HOA madness and revenge tales where this came from. And hey, if you want to show a little extra support, that thanks button down there, it's there for a reason. See y'all next time. Stay sharp, stay loud, and don't let anyone redraw your property lines.
From the whispers to the wreckage, QA Stories brings it all. Click that next video, if you can handle it.